In the UFC, show-offs are necessary as a part of the pre-fighting process, but a number of fighters have used this as an avenue to endear their fans. Some of these stare-downs have been ridiculously hilarious, or just plain goofy, and on some other times, it has turned into a very intense affair where some of the fights even become violent. While Sean O'Connell might not be the best or most popular fighter in the history of MMA, he will surely go down as having one of the funniest face-offs in the history of the sport. Now, let's take a look at some of the funniest MMA face-offs you probably didn't know about. UFC strawweight, Paige VanZandt versus Michelle Waterson. On December 15th, 2016, both fighters faced off against each other in the main event of the fight. After completing the weigh-in procedures, both fighters stood facing each other, and the unexpected happened. Rather than stare down each other's face and create some sort of tension, a dance-off performance started. This dance-off performance was so iconic that fans forgot for a moment that these fighters would be going against each other in the ring. Consequently, Michelle Waterson, known to her fans as the Karate Hottie, picked up a quick first-round win over VanZandt. UFC heavyweight, Pat Barry versus Stefan Struve. How intimidating can it be to face off against a fighter that is as tall as a skyscraper? Well, Pat Barry knows how it feels. Both Barry and Struve were fighters who had made their mark in the UFC. So, in 2011, when they were scheduled for a fight, it got fans excited. But what would first become memorable was the face-off session. Stefan Struve is the tallest fighter in the history of the UFC, standing at 7 feet. It is no surprise that his nickname is the skyscraper. During the face-off, it was announced that this was the largest height gap in the history of the UFC. To perhaps increase his chances, Pat Barry stood on the scale and decided to face off like that. Unfortunately, he still wasn't as tall as the fighter. He then got off the scales, making him look like a midget before the skyscraper. He made a joke of the situation by pressing his face against the chest of Struve before finally breaking off. Jon Jones versus Daniel Cormier. The first thought that would come to your mind after seeing this is thinking, no, that face-off wasn't funny. And you'd be right. This is because the face-off had resulted in a fight that caused several people to interfere and separate the fighters. But here's a little background to help you find the humor in this. Jones and Cormier don't like each other, and when the UFC 178 was announced, the entire MMA community knew the ring was going to be on fire. They also knew that the weigh-in was going to come with some tension, which would of course lead to a fight if care wasn't taken. At this time, it was the lovable Dave Scholler, the former senior vice president of public relations, that was in charge of getting in between fighters if he discovers that it is about to get violent. It was a fun and honorable job until it was time to stand in between Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier. Now, here's where it gets funny. Right before the face-off, he stands in the middle of both fighters. He appears to be in charge, but the look on his face says the opposite. In a split second, one of the fighters push him off, and you would see that he becomes clearly overwhelmed. Helpless, he is pushed into the backdrop before other people come around to separate the fighters. Both fighters should really apologize to Dave Scholler, but it doesn't end there. With Daniel Cormier now safely separated from Jones, it seems like the fight had ended, but not for Cormier. He removed his shoe and threw it overhead, hoping it landed on Jones. Unfortunately, the shoe landed on the head of a videographer for the Las Vegas Review-Journal. One more person to apologize to. UFC 162, Anderson Silva versus Chris Weidman. Anderson Silva is one of the most intimidating fighters in the history of the UFC. A former UFC middleweight champion, he holds the record for the longest title reign in UFC history at 2,457 days. In 2013, Anderson Silva was defending his title against Chris Weidman, and their face-off was expected to be regular since both fighters had had no beef in the past. However, it can get really intense when fighters stare at each other for a few seconds, and this was the case in UFC 162. At the face-off, Silva approached his opponent with his hand behind his back, showing that he was confident. Weidman, on the other hand, decided it would be cool to show Silva that he wasn't here for jokes. In showing this, he kept on moving towards Silva, with his face edged towards him, and both fighters' faces merged into a kiss. Just right before it turned into something else, Dana White separated the fighters. Even though it had been really brief, it was silly and ridiculously funny to watch. Just after the stare down, comedian and commentator Joe Rogan asked Chris Weidman what it was like to kiss Anthony Silva. Weidman replied saying he thinks Anthony Silva has nice lips. He then went on Twitter saying, "By the way, doesn't count as a kiss unless you pucker up." Fortunately, Weidman won the fight, an impressive addition to his then growing career. Jon Jones versus Rumble Johnson. Dana White has seen the weirdest, funniest, and most violent face-offs. His body has taken punches, he has had to catch chairs, and even put his body between very dangerous fighters. As you can imagine, when it is time for these face-offs, he gets really anxious and silently prays it does not get violent. But Dana White knows his chances of getting hit during a face-off increases by multiple folds once it involves Jon Jones. Well, it's Jon Jones. However, something very surprising happened in the press conference that naturally precedes every fight. Jon Jones and Rumble Johnson decided to play a prank on the UFC president during their showdown. The fighters began a fake scuffle, and Dana White immediately stepped in to stop them. However, after a brief moment, Jones and Johnson revealed to the president that it was just a prank. He laughed, but there's no doubt he must have gone, "not again," in his head. Unfortunately, as fun as this was, the fight never happened. This was due to Jones's hit-and-run accident. However, Johnson has stated, "The only way I'd come out of retirement is if Jon Jones goes to heavyweight. I can officially say I did my job, and my mission is complete. Although I didn't win a title, I fought the best of the best." Nick Diaz versus Frank Shamrock. In the past, press conferences could have easily passed as very boring advertisements. They usually included the fighters in suits, a lot of talk, and unnecessary applause. However, with the rise of fighters like Jon Jones, Conor McGregor, and the Diaz brothers, the press conference became an event nobody wanted to miss. This was because these fighters brought a new twist to these events, making it as ridiculous, tense, and funny as possible. One ridiculous event happened in 2009 during the Strike Force Shamrock vs. Diaz event in San Jose, California. When it was time for the showdown, rather than shake his hands and then get into the fight pose, Nick Diaz did something nobody saw coming. He raised his hand like he was going for a handshake, only to raise the middle finger to his opponent. He didn't take it down immediately. Instead, he pushes his finger forward as if he is placing a strong emphasis on the gesture. As if to retaliate, Shamrock grabs his junk and makes a funny face. Almost immediately, the men do the traditional fight pose for the camera, facing one another. But even when Shamrock turns around to face the crowd, Diaz still has his body facing his opponent, turning his face for only a brief moment. Sean O'Connell almost all the time. If you've been following the fighter, then you must have seen him doing something silly during his weigh-ins. O'Connell has become so reputable for being silly that fans always anticipate what he would come up with next. Once in a fight, he started blowing bubbles to diffuse the tension. He has also given his opponent a protein drink and engaged him in a drink-off. If you think bringing pizza to a stare-down is weird, that would not be the case for O'Connell, as he once gave his opponent a slice of pizza. He also stole a selfie during a show-off. Come on, who does that? His nose boop on Matt Van Buren was also quite funny, but his opponent didn't find it that way. All of these were very funny, but what would be considered as his funniest occurred in his face-off against Anthony Perosh. As you already know, during the stare-down, fighters are meant to raise their fists, looking like they are ready to start a fight. What nobody talks about is how this looks like you are playing rock, paper, scissors. Well, O'Connell knows this, and during his stare-down with Perosh, he plays the game with himself, and then raises his hand in victory. While this might seem like a silly little joke, what makes it funnier is the unmoving stance and blank expression of Perosh, an expression which says, "What is going on?" And with that, we wrap up this video. Thank you for watching.